The station's lights flickered out, one by one, as Lucas Daniels sprinted through the narrow corridor, his boots pounding against the metal flooring. A wave of static washed over the comm channel, then a distorted voice cut through, its tone sharp and urgent. "Sergeant Daniels, report. Are you still?" The transmission sputtered before cutting off entirely. His helmet's visor shimmered with the faint red glow of emergency lights. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he didn't break stride. No time for reports. No time for anything. The mission had gone sideways, and now, the only thing left to do was survive. He turned a corner, muscles burning, the air thick with the faint scent of ionized metal. Ahead, a door slid open with a hiss. He dove into the room without hesitation, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. His breath came fast, his chest heaving. His fingers hovered near the sidearm holstered at his waist. He didn't draw it yet. Not unless he had to. The silence was shattered by a low, almost inaudible hum, a vibration in the walls that sent a shiver down his spine. He knew what it meant. The assassins were here. He crouched down, positioning himself in the shadows, eyes darting to the windows. The colony's view of the deep space beyond glowed with starlight, but it was little more than a distraction now. The walls were too thin, the rooms too exposed. If they got in here, he'd be dead within seconds. And they would come. They always did. The softest of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Then, a flash of movement, too quick to catch clearly, but unmistakable. An assassin. The Empire had sent its best, just as Lucas had feared. They'd known he would be here, and they were waiting. Their timing was flawless. Another step, closer now. They were circling. Lucas kept his back flat against the wall, his hands slipping to the comm on his belt. A quick press, and a new transmission buzzed through. Static again, then a familiar voice, barely audible, strained. "Sergeant, we've got, damn it." The voice cut off once more, and Lucas cursed under his breath. Another dead transmission. He could feel it. The walls around him seemed to pulse with the weight of the imminent threat. There was no way he'd be able to call for backup in time, not with whatever these assassins had scrambled to block his communications. He checked his gear quickly, knife, sidearm, the compact plasma rifle slung across his back. Enough to fight his way out of a dozen situations. But not enough for this. No, he'd need to outthink them. Another shadow flitted by the door, just out of sight. Lucas didn't hesitate. He took a breath and shifted into the open, moving like a ghost, the tip of his rifle coming to life in his hands. His eyes were trained on the doorway, waiting for any sign of movement. Time stretched in the thick, suffocating silence. Every second felt like a lifetime. Then, a voice. "Come out, Lucas. We know you're in there." It was soft, almost mocking, and Lucas felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. There was no mistaking it. This was the voice of someone who had already studied him, someone who was certain of the outcome. Someone who had already planned every move, calculated every angle. "Kyra," Lucas muttered under his breath. He'd heard rumors, whispers of a name that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest soldiers in the galaxy. The head assassin of the Galactic Empire, a woman so dangerous she was whispered about in hushed tones. She was here. And if she was calling him out, that meant one thing: she knew exactly who he was. She knew exactly what he could do. And she wasn't afraid. "I'm not going anywhere," Lucas called back, his voice steady, though his muscles were taut, ready to spring. "You'll have to come to me." There was no response at first. The seconds ticked by with unbearable tension. Then, a soft clink of metal on metal. A low laugh, barely audible. "I was hoping you'd say that." Before Lucas could react, the door exploded inward, its hinges snapping with an ear-splitting crash. He flung himself to the side, his rifle already raised, but it was too late. Kyra was already inside. Her movements were fluid, precise. A blur of speed. She was dressed in sleek, dark armor that blended seamlessly with the shadows, her helmet obscured by a translucent visor. She held nothing in her hands, no weapons, no tools, but Lucas could feel the menace radiating off her. She didn't need weapons. Her body was a weapon. He fired. The blast streaked across the room, narrowly missing her. She didn't flinch, didn't even try to dodge. Instead, she shifted to the side, her foot tapping the floor once, twice, each step an elegant dance that brought her closer. "I've studied your tactics," she said, her voice calm, detached. "You're predictable. And you're far too slow for me." Lucas clenched his teeth. The woman was right. Every attack he'd made so far had been a simple response to her actions, nothing more than instinct. She had the upper hand, of course she did. She always did. But there was one thing she didn't know. He wasn't just a soldier. He was an Earth Marine, and Earth didn't give up. Ever. Another shot rang out. This time, he didn't wait. As she moved to evade, he threw himself toward her with a roar, tackling her to the floor. The impact was bone-shaking, but she twisted under him with unsettling ease, flinging him off in a fluid motion, like she'd expected it all along. "I will kill you, Lucas," Kyra whispered, standing over him now, her eyes narrowing. "But first, I want you to understand why." Her hand reached to her waist, and Lucas, recognizing the motion, lunged forward once more. But it was too late. She was faster. And the last thing Lucas saw before everything went black was the glint of her blade. The cold sting of steel against Lucas's skin was the first thing he felt when his consciousness returned. He groaned, fighting the urge to open his eyes, knowing the moment he did, the pain would hit. But that didn't matter. What mattered was surviving. Slowly, he forced his eyes open, his vision swimming before settling into focus. The world around him was dim, flickering lights, shadows stretching across the walls. The air smelled stale, metallic, and still. The room was small, too small for comfort. A cell, he realized. His pulse quickened, but he forced it under control. "Strapped down, huh?" His voice rasped in the silence, but the words were his lifeline. A reminder that he was still alive. Across from him, the faint outline of a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, imposing silhouette. Then, the voice, calm, almost bored. "I thought you'd wake up soon, Sergeant. I must say, you've made a name for yourself." Kyra's voice, cold as ice, sliced through the room. "It's a shame you'll be remembered for your failure." Lucas fought against the restraints, testing the strength of the cuffs that held his arms in place. The metal was solid, but not unbreakable. He just needed time. Time he didn't have. "You're not going to kill me, are you?" Lucas said, his voice gritty, defiant despite the uncertainty. He couldn't let her know how close he was to panicking. Not yet. Not until he figured out a way to turn the tide. Kyra's laugh was a soft sound, almost sadistic. "Oh, I don't need to kill you, Lucas. Not yet, anyway. What's far more interesting is watching you try to escape." He narrowed his eyes, clenching his fists in frustration. Escape. Right. She had him cornered. For now. The moment she underestimated him, though, would be the moment her confidence cracked. "How long do you think I'll last?" he asked, his words laced with challenge. "You think I'm just another soldier, don't you? You think I'm just going to roll over and die?" Kyra's expression didn't change, her eyes, cold and calculating, remained locked on him. "I don't care what you think, Sergeant. The fact is, you're out of options. The Empire's influence is everywhere now, and you're just a relic of a dead world." Lucas exhaled slowly, his eyes darting around the cell, scanning for any weakness. He didn't speak at first, he didn't need to. Kyra's arrogance would be her downfall. It always was. He'd been in situations like this before, on hostile planets with no way out, and he'd made it through every single time. "Relic, huh," he muttered, almost to himself. "Funny. I thought we were just getting started. Kyra tilted her head slightly, a movement that spoke of curiosity, but there was no real interest. You've heard the rumors, I suppose. The Earth Marine Corps, how they were once feared. Now, they're just history. She took a step closer, her boots barely making a sound. But there's no place for you anymore. The galaxy has moved on. Lucas didn't react, keeping his face neutral, his thoughts sharp. He knew exactly what she was doing, baiting him, trying to get him to crack. But she didn't know the half of it. No, he finally said, his voice low. I don't think the galaxy's moved on. I think it's forgotten something important. And what would that be? Kyra asked, amusement lacing her tone. That Earth Marines never quit. Kyra stopped in her tracks, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted. It was brief, a flicker of doubt, a crack in the veneer of invincibility. But it was there. She straightened, her voice turning icy once more. Don't delude yourself. This isn't somewhere you're used to. You've got no backup here. No support. Just you, alone. Lucas clenched his jaw. She was right about one thing, he was alone. But not for long. You're right. No backup, he said, voice steady, unwavering. But that's where you're wrong. You see, I don't need an army. I just need a plan. Kyra's eyebrow twitched. She stepped back, almost in disbelief, as if trying to measure his resolve. Then, she scoffed, turning away. A plan? What kind of plan could you possibly have? An Earth Marine plan, Lucas answered flatly. He didn't elaborate. The last thing he wanted to do was give her an idea of his next move. The door to the cell slid open with a soft hiss, and the figure of a guard appeared in the doorway. Lucas didn't even spare him a glance. His eyes never left Kyra, watching her carefully. She gave a quick nod, and the guard stepped forward. You're lucky, Sergeant. You'll get one last chance. The Empire wants you alive, for now. Kyra's gaze was sharp, her voice firm. We'll see if your plan can save you. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, the door sealing behind her with a finality that echoed in Lucas's chest. Left alone, Lucas let out a slow breath. He wasn't going to let her win, not this time. He'd survived worse odds. His mind clicked into overdrive. The restraints were loose enough for him to maneuver, and there was a slight gap between the wall and the floor. He could use that. His training kicked in, his body moving almost instinctively, gathering every ounce of patience and skill he had. There was no room for mistakes. The seconds felt like minutes as he worked the restraints, feeling for the right angle, the right pressure. It was a delicate dance, and he was used to it. His fingers moved in a practiced rhythm, each small movement bringing him closer to freedom. Minutes later, with a quiet snap, the restraints came loose. He allowed himself a single, triumphant breath. He wasn't done yet, but the first hurdle had been cleared. Lucas glanced toward the door, his thoughts already racing ahead. He would need to get out, and quickly. He couldn't afford to stay in the same spot for long. Kyra would come back. With a practiced movement, he slipped out of the cell, his boots making no sound as he moved. It was time to put his plan into action. The galaxy might have moved on, but Earth hadn't. And neither had he. Lucas crouched in the shadows, the cold steel of the hallway biting through his armor as he moved silently. The sounds of his breath were drowned by the whir of machinery and distant voices. His muscles were taut, his mind sharp, calculating. Every step he took brought him closer to freedom or to an early grave. He wasn't sure how long it had been since he'd escaped the cell. Hours? A day? Time didn't matter now. What mattered was survival. Kyra was still out there, and Lucas knew better than to think she'd forgotten about him. The Empire's top assassin didn't let her prey slip away. He was still her target. He always would be until one of them was dead. As he moved through the corridors, his ears caught a faint noise, a quick, calculated shuffle of footsteps. There was no mistaking it. Someone was close. Someone trained. Someone deadly. Lucas pressed himself against the wall, muscles coiled, fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of his plasma rifle. His heart rate quickened, but his mind remained calm. He didn't have the luxury of panic. He had to outthink her. That's how he'd survived up to this point. A soft whisper of movement. His instincts kicked in. He whirled around, raising his rifle, but found nothing. The hallway was empty, lit only by the dull glow of emergency lights. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Too much tension. He couldn't let his mind trick him. Not now. Not when everything depended on his focus. Then, the voice came again, a soft taunt that made his blood run cold. "You're slipping, Lucas." Kyra's voice. It was calm, distant, like she was speaking to someone far beneath her. He didn't need to look to know she was there. He could feel it in his bones. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "You think you can hide from me?" she continued, her voice smooth as velvet. "I've been tracking your every move since the moment you set foot in this place. You're predictable." Lucas clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around his rifle's grip. She was toying with him, drawing him out. It was her game. Always had been. And he was the pawn. But not anymore. With a sudden movement, he lunged from his position, diving down the hallway in a low, swift roll, the rifle raised and aimed. He didn't care if it was a trap. He didn't care if she was already 2 steps ahead. He had one shot at this. His eyes locked onto her silhouette at the far end of the hall, her posture too relaxed, her confidence dripping from her every movement. She wasn't even armed, not yet, at least. The arrogance of it stung. She didn't think he was a threat. Not until he showed her otherwise. He fired. The bolt shot through the air with a high-pitched hum, racing toward her with deadly precision. But just as quickly, she shifted, her body moving with inhuman grace, avoiding the blast by mere inches. Lucas cursed under his breath. Of course, she'd dodge. She'd been trained to anticipate every move. Before he could react, Kyra disappeared into the shadows, her movement so fluid it was almost ghostly. He gritted his teeth, realizing she wasn't running, she was closing in. Every step, every breath, every moment brought her closer. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat. Then, she spoke again. "You can't win this. You've already lost." Her voice was closer now, dangerously close. Lucas's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't over yet. He ducked into a small maintenance room, the door sliding shut behind him. His mind raced. What was the next move? What did he have left? A noise. A soft scrape at the corner of the door. She was here. Without a second thought, he spun, throwing a flash grenade into the hallway. The bright, searing light erupted through the small window in the door, blinding him for a split second. But it was enough. The moment the grenade detonated, he bolted, slipping past her, silently moving through the space, taking advantage of the momentary disorientation. Kyra's growl of frustration echoed down the hallway. She wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. Lucas smiled to himself, his breath shallow. He couldn't keep running, though. She'd catch him. She always caught her prey. He needed a plan. He ducked into another corner, his back against the cool, hard wall. He could hear her footsteps, slow now, deliberate. She was playing with him. He didn't have the luxury of that. He had to finish this. A soft hiss. The sound of the door unlocking. Kyra stepped into the room. "Do you even realize how foolish this is?" Her voice was cold, almost disappointed, like she was humoring him. "You're out of your depth. You've got no backup. No hope." Lucas stepped out of the shadows, plasma rifle aimed directly at her chest. "I think you're wrong," he said, his voice steady, his aim unshakable. "You're the one who's out of your depth." Kyra's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before it was replaced with a smirk. You think you can kill me with that? You're already dead, Sergeant. And then, she moved. In the blink of an eye, she was across the room, her hand reaching for his throat. He barely had time to react, sidestepping just enough to avoid her grasp, but her fingers grazed his collar. He swung the rifle, aiming for her side, but she deflected it with a brutal twist of her arm. The rifle flew from his hands, clattering to the floor. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But then, a spark ignited in him, an ember that flared into something more. He wasn't done yet. He dropped to the ground, rolling out of her reach, and grabbed the first thing he could find, a discarded wrench. With a swift, desperate swing, he struck, catching her off guard. The blow landed hard against her armored side, forcing her back, just enough for him to scramble to his feet. Kyra hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, Lucas took his chance. "I'm not done yet, Kyra," he growled, his voice raw with fury. She stared at him, her expression a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. She'd underestimated him. She thought he was just another soldier, another obstacle. But Lucas Daniels was Earth's last line of defense, and he wasn't going down without a fight. "You're still alive," she said, her voice cold again. Impressive. But not for long. Without warning, she lunged once more. This time, Lucas was ready. Lucas's chest heaved as he stood over the smoldering wreckage of the room. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal, and the dim light flickered in a stuttering rhythm, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. His heart was still pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins, but his mind was focused, unwavering. Kyra was down. For now. He wasn't sure what had broken first, their clash or his resolve. But he knew one thing: the time for hesitation had passed. He could feel her presence just beyond the walls, waiting, calculating. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The explosion had bought him time, but it wasn't going to last. Kyra wasn't the kind of person who stayed down for long. She'd get up. She always did. The room was small, the walls closing in. Lucas moved quickly, checking his gear. The plasma rifle was gone, tossed aside in their frantic struggle. The wrench still clung to his hand, now slick with sweat and blood. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. He checked the exits. His pulse quickened as his mind worked through the options. He could try to run, but he knew better. Running wasn't going to help. Kyra was faster, smarter, and far deadlier. He couldn't afford to let her track him again. This was it. One final confrontation. "You're still alive," Kyra's voice came from behind him, calm as ever, as if she hadn't just been knocked across the room. "Impressive. I'll give you that." Lucas spun, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts, but he didn't raise the wrench. Not yet. He had no illusions about her capabilities. If he swung it, she would dodge. She always did. "Why don't you just finish it, Kyra?" Lucas's voice was rough, defiant, his words cutting through the silence between them. "Why play these games?" She tilted her head, her eyes glinting through the shadow of her helmet. "Because I'm curious, Lucas. I'm curious to see how long you can keep this up. You're human. You've got limits." "Yeah, well, I haven't hit mine yet." She chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "That's where you're wrong. You're already bleeding. Your strength is waning. You're tired, Sergeant. You're out of options." Lucas's eyes narrowed. She was right. He was tired. Every muscle screamed for rest, and the blood trickling down from his side reminded him that he wasn't invincible. But he wasn't out of the fight, not yet. There was one thing Kyra didn't understand about Earth Marines. They didn't give up. Not when the odds were stacked against them. Not when death was staring them in the face. "I still have one thing left," Lucas said, his voice calm, steady. "And that's my will to fight." Kyra stepped closer, her movements measured, almost deliberate. "Then let's see how far that will can carry you." She was on him in an instant, her movements fluid and precise. Lucas barely had time to react, but instinct kicked in. He dropped low, the wrench swinging in a wide arc, connecting with her side just as she tried to grab him. She grunted, stumbling back, but it wasn't enough to stop her. Kyra was a machine, fast, lethal, relentless. Not bad, she sneered, wiping a streak of blood from her lip, but you're still too slow. She lunged again, faster this time, her hand flashing out to grab his throat. Lucas twisted, ducking under her grasp, his muscles burning with the effort. He shoved her off balance, but it was like pushing against a wall. She recovered too quickly, her foot sweeping toward his legs. He barely jumped out of the way in time. The fight was becoming a blur of close calls and frantic dodges. His body was screaming for rest, but he couldn't give in. Not now. The sound of Kyra's breath in his ear, the snap of her movements, was all-consuming. Every time he thought he might get a hit in, she was already gone, already circling again. It was the same dance they'd been doing for what felt like hours. And yet, Lucas didn't stop. He couldn't. The thought of giving up wasn't an option. He'd fought too long, too hard for this moment. Then, a mistake. Kyra's left leg, her favored leg, stumbled just slightly, an imperceptible shift in her stance. It was small, but it was enough. In that fraction of a second, Lucas knew what he had to do. He feigned another swing with the wrench, but this time, he didn't follow through. Instead, he dropped low, slamming his shoulder into her midsection. She staggered back, caught off guard by the sudden attack. Her balance faltered, and that was all Lucas needed. He pressed his advantage. His hands were on her in an instant, grabbing her arm, twisting it behind her back. She hissed, a sound of pain and frustration. But Lucas didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He needed to end this, now. Kyra struggled, her feet kicking, her body shifting as she tried to free herself. But Lucas had the leverage now. He forced her arm up higher, bending it at a painful angle. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she fought to break free, but he held firm. "You're not getting away this time," Lucas growled through gritted teeth, his voice a low growl of exhaustion and resolve. "Let go of me, Sergeant," Kyra spat. Her voice was cold, but there was a flicker of something Lucas didn't quite recognize, beneath the surface. A crack in her perfection. "I'm not your soldier anymore, Kyra," Lucas said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension. "I'm a Marine. And Marines don't lose." With one final twist, Lucas forced her to the ground, the impact of her body against the cold floor reverberating through the room. She gasped, the air knocked out of her, but she didn't make a sound after that. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, Lucas stood over her, panting, his body a tangle of aches and exhaustion. He looked down at the woman who had almost killed him. She was still breathing, but she wasn't moving. Not anymore. Lucas's grip loosened, but he didn't step back. He could feel the weight of her gaze, even without seeing her eyes. Kyra Zan, the Empire's deadliest assassin, was finally at his mercy. He could end it here, right now. One move, and she'd be gone. But he didn't. Not yet. "I think I've proven my point," Lucas said, his voice quiet, but firm. "This fight is over."